Today, we are joined by Todd Anderson, Teledyne ISCO Global Chromatography Specialist. With that, I would like to welcome Todd.
Thank you, Sharon. Thank you, everyone else, for joining us today. We hope that you can get something out of this and that we can help your chromatography go a little bit better in the future. I'm going to start off with a brief outline of today's topics. So as you can see here, there's pump head diagnostics, detectors and flow cells, sample injection, both optimization and loading considerations, and then sampling techniques that we use here at Teledyne, column considerations that we can use to protect your columns, and troubleshooting your HPLC methods. So to start, we're going to go into pump head diagnostics. So one of the first things that we like to show people is what we consider a good pumping system. A dual reciprocating pumping system is probably the most robust system in the industry, especially when you consider it has high pressure mixing. It gives you the most robust and accurate delivery for chromatography. Our AccuPrep system, which is what I'm going to be using for our demonstration today, is going to be the premise for most of the slides that I'm showing you. 150 mils per minute is what we can do, and up to 6,000 PSI. As you can see right here, this is our pump sled taking out of a service instrument that was actually PM'd in-house. And so I'm going to take this information and use it for some of the upcoming slides. So with pressure profiles, this is the first troubleshooting technique that I like to give to customers. So either you're going to run water and acetonitrile or water methanol, assuming you're running reverse phase. The top trace, as you can see here, is a high pressure water start out with about probably 90%. And then we're going to go down to about 10% water, 90% acetonitrile. In this case, it goes up to 100%. But as you can see, the pressure trace drop as the chromatogram goes along. This is a good, well-performing instrument, as you can also see by the chromatography of our universal test mix. The bottom chromatogram would be indicative of a water and methanol transition. So as you can see in the middle of the trace, there's slightly higher pressure with the water and methanol at around 50-50. And then it comes back to a similar pressure on both the water and the methanol individually. The bottom chromatogram is actually a spiked chromatogram with acetone that allows us to monitor the UV trace and the mixing capacity and dead volume of the system. And you'll see that by this red trace right here. So that red trace is actually the UV profile of the spiked acetone. Next, we're going to give you a chromatogram that does not look very good. And as you'll see out here on the end, there's a lot of spikes and a lot of noise. That indicates a pump that started out pretty well, but as it went on, it started having problems. Typically, this will indicate that there is a problem on your secondary pump, or a possibility that air bubbles have leached into the system, possibly on any one of the four heads that I previously showed you. With the Teledyne systems, we all use pressure fluctuation monitors. So if the system does see an excessive pressure, it will actually stop the system, give you a notification, and allow you to try and make corrections for such a problem. If the peaks come out early, then it's typically going to tell you that you're running too much acetonitrile, which means that you might have a problem with the aqueous pump head. So you may want to take a look at the aqueous side. If you have peaks coming out late, obviously it'll be the opposite. So that would typically indicate a problem with your aqueous or with your organic line. And you'll also see a lower pressure than normal at the beginning of the run. That's why I like to use the pressure trace run in a system as a first pass evaluation. So we can actually use that for future reference to see if your pressure is going up, your pressure is going down, or if you're getting a different type of profile. It will also help you determine if you have a problem with your solvents. So some of the remedies that we can look at is right in here, if you'll see air bubbles in these lines, then we can actually do a prime purge with our system to try and get rid of those air bubbles. It's a common problem that we see. The other possibility is if we have oscillations, it could be in these check valves right here, which are also indicated down here at the bottom. Leaking piston seals, which is in behind, right in here. So it'd be right back in there where that piston goes in and out. You could have a leak there. Or there could be blockages if you get excessive pressure. And they could be just about anywhere. As a matter of fact, the other day, the first time I've ever had an Teledyne issue with the mixing valve, someone actually blocked up their mixing chamber. So you just basically have to pick and choose and just work your way back through the system to see where the blockages are. I'm going to go into some stuff later that will help you determine, or I should say, prevent some of the blockages that you might get during injection. Some of the flow cell considerations that we look at is choosing an optimal wavelength so that you can increase your yields and purity. A lot of times people will take UV spectral data of their compounds from other sources, whether it be an LC or UV spec. But we also need to be aware of mobile phase background conditions that could cause a problem. We can obviously get the optimal UV vis wavelength from a chromatogram on the AccuPrep already run, and we can do this in a scout run and then scale that up later. As you can see, right in here would probably be your optimal wavelength, so we could choose that wavelength for your prep run. We can also do this post-run, and it allows you to scale up, and it also allows you to determine where the minimal amount of solvent interference would be as well from your mobile phase. Here's where we can actually use all wavelengths. So we can actually use that to get rid of some of the solvent interference. We can also use that same option to create a third wavelength channel where I've had several customers actually use this if they have 3 compounds with different wavelengths. We can also determine the length and strength of the lamp usage right here. We're in the green, so we're still pretty good with our lamp throughput. And this is done under our manual control. Next, I'm going to get into sample injection optimization. All samples are going to be loaded in a liquid form for prep chromatography. The dissolution solvent is very important, and the techniques that you use will affect that loading amount as well. First and foremost, always filter your samples. It'll protect your system from blockages and possible column failures, which I'll get into later. So this is a quick way to filter your samples. This is what we've typically done in the past, is just use a filter cartridge. We can also use these kinds of cartridges right down here. So you can load them up, fill them in, and do a vacuum filtration as well. As you can see here, we have a Lure port adapter that allows us to load large amounts of sample. The reason I like these is because they have a very large opening and there's not a whole lot of restriction in trying to put your sample into the injector loop. They also prevent your some other issues, which I'm going to get into on the next slide. Now there's a blunt tip needle syringe port that we can also supply you with, and you can see that over here. That will allow you to do smaller analytical size injections. It's a 22 gauge needle. You can flush it. There's a little less dead volume in there, so you get less carryover and less problem in that manner. It does limit your gauge of needle, so you also get a lot more restriction when you're trying to put your samples onto the loop. The problem with that is that this tends to happen. So occasionally we'll get someone who decides to use a GC Lure type needle, and that slant tip causes this. So you can actually score the rotor seals and actually cause it to leak, and then you don't get a full injection in the future. The other thing we can also do as far as particulate goes is we can also put one of these in line, and it will help save your main column. It's just a simple pre-filter, an inline column filter. So some of the sample loading conditions, we're going to do it, usually is our 5 mil loop is our standard. It can be both 1/16 or 1/8, but low laminar flow issues can actually cause reduced loading capacity. The larger loops allow us to unload more though, and then especially with those types of injector loops, injector devices like the Lure tip adapters. we want to make sure that we get all the sample onto the system without any loss. So what I suggest is typically tell people to use our auto sample module. We have 2 or 3 different ways of doing that. But typically in this particular instance, our standard auto sampler is what I tell people to use because it allows you to cushion your sample with air and prevent some mixing. Most people will do manual injections up to about 50%. With the auto sampler, we can actually go a little bit higher. The next thing I'm going to get into is the options for solvent. The diluent, obviously the best possible condition is if your sample is completely soluble in water, because you won't get any mobile phase effects where the sample gets pulled through your system. The problem is most samples are not soluble in water. Then the next step, many customers will try and use methanol or acetonitrile, which is definitely higher in solubility, but it will give peak distortion, as you can see here in a second. DMSO, DMF, DMA, there's some other ones out there too that are very, very soluble for compounds. The problem is it also is very soluble for things like catalysts and other types of stuff that you really don't want to be putting onto your columns either. So in order to go through and make sure that we get that cleaned up, here's a quick screenshot of some different media that people will use. The stuff on the right is actually a loose pack. So you could just basically put this scavenger material into a vial of your sample, shake it up and let it precipitate out. And then you can decant your sample as a pure sample without any metals that crash out on the column. You can do, as I said, you can either do cartridges over here or loose powder. So here's some loading conditions where I try to show how loading too much material in different solvents can actually affect your chromatography. As you can see, as I mentioned before, I got an impurity right here because I tried to heat up my sample in water because of the solubility. So the compound actually decomposed. With that, I didn't have to do anything with the methanol. So the methanol looks great, as you can see right here. The DMSO looks good as well. Now you'll notice, as I mentioned earlier about the UV being paramount, as you'll notice, we don't get any void marker here with the water or the methanol. And at 200 microliter injection, everything still looks pretty good all the way across. You can't see the 214 trace if you had breakthrough right here, because the DMSO does actually have a low cutoff. If you had DMF in here, then you wouldn't be able to see 214 or 254. So if your compound does have a 254 chromophore, this will work out quite nicely for you using DMSO. It's actually my solvent of choice. At 500 microliters, you can still see we don't have any breakthrough at all for the DMSO. The methanol is starting to break through some of the compound. Water is still the same. We have the impurity, but no breakthrough. So again, we're still either water or DMSO. Now let's get up to 2 mil injection. We're still fine with the water. However, look at what happened with the DMSO and the methanol. We're getting a lot of breakthrough now and completely lost resolution. So now we're going to get in some of the techniques that I mentioned to you earlier about doing different types of injection. We have an auto injector, a sample loading pump, and an actual auto sampler. My preference obviously is the auto sampler. It's simpler and it gives us a lot of different options, but I will go through the different advantages of each. So if you look at the auto injector, it's good for reproducibility and you can do injections down to 10 microliter. The problem is you can only use one sample per sample queue. You can have one injection volume for the entire series of samples. And you have to actually have user intervention to do wash out the loop and the needle and everything else at the end of the run. The nice thing about the auto sampler is we can do everything that you can with the auto injector, but we can do different samples as well. We can allow different injection volumes, and it's a completely automated process. We also then pick up the additional fraction collector positions as well right here. So we actually get up to 4 racks of collection. We can also do bracketed samples, which means those samples that were crashing out potentially for you that were loaded in DMSO, we can pull up a DMSO slug before and after your sample to prevent it from crashing out and help it to get onto the column before it actually would actually collapse and cause blockages in your system. The sample loading pump is great if you're doing water-soluble samples or if you need to load large amounts of material. that you can actually capture, whether it's like a size exclusion or something where you're actually trapping the compound for a period of time on the column, maybe an ion chromatography, something where you're focusing the compound on the head of the column. There's no limitation for loop size. It's great for diluting samples in weak solvent. And we do have an adjustable flow rate, so we can mix and match that with the system of choice so that we can actually determine the ratios while we're adding the sample. As you can see here, this is a large volume loading where the first injection is a standard 1 ml manual injection. The peak shape's pretty good on it. We take that same 1 ml and dilute it out to 10 in methanol and inject the same amount of sample with 10 mils of methanol, and you can see it's a pretty bad distortion, and the samples are pretty much smeared all over the place. So we do that same exact injection, but this time we take that 10 mils and we pump it on in a 50-50 mixture with the mobile phase at a low concentration. So we're basically diluting the sample as it's getting put on in this period of 2 minutes. And now all of a sudden the peaks are actually much sharper than what they were doing the standard 1 mil injection. So this is what your true loading is on the column. So as you can see, large amounts of materials, we can actually do some pretty good focusing with them. So now we're going to look at some column and mobile phase considerations to protect your column. In order to improve peak shape, typically you're going to use pH modifiers. Usually TFA is one of the big ones. You can go ethylamines if you want to go up in pH. The problem with going up in pH is obviously it can damage some of your columns. If you have columns that are only stable up to about 7 for their pH, then you might start losing some stationary phase, and I'll get into that in a minute. The modifier must be removed from your samples after they've been collected. Typically, this means freebasing them and possibly doing an extraction. That's why we suggest instead of TFA, maybe using formic or acetic if you can, because they're a little bit more volatile, especially if you're using it for mass spec or ELSD, so that we don't actually have problems with the solvent modifiers affecting your chromatography and your detection. Obviously, as I mentioned before, they must be compatible with your column. And we don't want to typically mix acids and bases on columns. Although I do tend to have people mixing and doing ion pairing if you're doing chiral chromatography. So this is an example of what it's like to use 3 different types of mobile phase conditions. If you look at the top, here's just basically compounds that we're trying to separate. When they're protonated, as you can see here in a low pH, there's a lot of retention. So that's great, that's what we want. But sometimes it's too much, so maybe we go to higher pH. They'll bring out the compounds a little bit earlier because they're deprotonated, but then we're also putting something onto the siloxanes and affecting the actual column chemistry. However, if you don't properly do either or, what you may get is a mixed mode chromatography, and that's the worst possible scenario. So you get peaks that are broad, tailing, possibly multiple components or species. So you might actually get 2 different peaks for the same compound. Stationary phase damage can actually happen if we don't take care of our columns well. One of the most common is voiding or channeling, and that'll be indicated by broad tailing peaks or split and broad peaks. The other possibility is plugging or sample precipitation, which I mentioned earlier with the DMSO injections. So what we want to do is we want to make sure that we are keeping our samples well solubilized before they hit the column, and making sure we don't put any residue or particles onto the system either. Let's see, it can be high pressures is obviously the indication of something like that. The loss of bonded phase can also happen, which will give us reduced retention, as you can see here at the bottom. So one way to help that with our systems is we will allow you to use a solvent selection system where we can choose one of 3 different solvents for both the A and for the B. So typically what people will do is the B pump will be organic, dealing with reverse phase, obviously. We can choose maybe methanol, acetonitrile, maybe a additive in one or not in the other. The ACE side is usually where we get the most changes if we're doing different types of chemistry. So we may have acidic water, we can have neutral water, and then we could have basic water, depending upon what kind of columns you're using. And your column manufacturer will be best to indicate what your mobile phase are for the best compounds separation. In order to do that, we also isolate our columns, and within the system, we can actually dedicate specific lines to specific columns and dedicate them to an individual solvent selection, so that you don't have to worry about causing problems with acids getting onto basic columns and bases getting onto acidic columns. It's up to 4 columns. I typically will put in the 4th position as a bypass so that we can actually flush the system out if you're using multiple modes of solvent. It allows for the potential of improper column installation as well, because you don't have to take the columns off and on. You just put them on once and you're done. We'll also extend the column and prevent leaks. And then we can also make sure that we choose the right sample size per column. It also allows us to do our focus gradient, which I'm going to get into shortly as well. That will allow us to do maybe an analytical type run on a 4.6 and then maybe scale up to a 2 centimeter and take the transition directly from one column to the other. So, and that's where I get into this. So this is troubleshooting our HPLC methods. We have a focus gradient generator, which allows us 3 steps to produce an optimal gradient. Typically, we optimize on as little as 10 microliters, but usually it's about 5 to 10% of what your total loading would be on your system. We can optimize it in just one simple run. We run a very fast gradient, and as I mentioned before, you can scale up on any size column, all the way up to a 50 millimeter if you need to. But we must have the matching stationary phase between the columns that you're scouting on and the column that you're actually going to run on. And we utilize the HP150 for that column switching that I just mentioned. Traditional chromatography would lead you to do an analytical run and say, okay, my peak came out at retention X. Whatever that zone would be then is you would run this gradient profile. Well, if you're late on this particular segment, then your peaks might come out late in your chromatography. But if you're early in this segment, then your peaks might come out early with that gradient profile. So how do you know which is which? We want to try and optimize for that. And we have actually taken that into account when we do the calculations for the gradient chromatography. The other thing you have to take into account is this delay volume. So this is the true gradient that's going through the column. This is what the system says your gradient actually is. So if you said that my gradient profile eluted at, say, 25%, in reality, it's somewhere closer to like 10 or 15. So you may actually not push your compound straight through. And here's an example of what it would mean to do the focus gradient. So as you can see, we have 4 compounds right here. They're relatively tight with almost no resolution, actually no resolution between the last 2-3 compounds. So how can we get these separated? We run a very fast gradient. We pick up what we would expect to be the optimal retention time or concentration for mobile phase from this point, and we would come in here and we adjust for the delay times. So at that point, even though it looks like it's 60 some percent, I think we're going to pull off maybe 60%, 63% B. We'll go ahead and make the run. I think somebody did this for me, but as you can see, we focused in, and this peak is going to show up in the middle of our run. That's where we would like it to be. Somewhere between 5 to 7 minutes is where we would typically put it on this particular chromatogram. So it allows us for faster methods, because we went from a 25-minute method up here down to potentially a 15-minute method if you just want to wash out and finish. And we have full resolution between all 4 components. So 4 compounds fully resolved. So it'll allow us to increase our sample loading as well. increase our throughput. And here's a real life example that I was able to run while I was in a customer's lab. They gave me a compound and said that this compound was about ready to get shipped out for the customer delivery. The chemist didn't think it was completely pure, but the analytical team said it was. So he brought me the compound to see what I could come up with. As you can see right here, it looks like it's one peak. I ran the scout run, as you can see here by the gradient profile. Only had a little tiny impurity here and here. So I'm like, well, I mean, we could definitely clean it up a little bit. So let's, focus in on it. We chose the focus gradient profile. I think it's wound up being like 70 to 90 is what we chose for the gradient profile. But when we ran it, we were actually able to pull a 30% impurity out of the backside of this compound. The analyst then said that he was showing a 30% impurity when he actually ran it on NMR, and that's why he refused to let it be released. So basically, we ran a 1 milligram scout, ran a 30 milligram purification, and we're able to actually get their isolated material right here, 100% pure. So the focus gradient is universal. It works on any type of column, silica, C8, C18. I've even used it on some chiral columns in the past. It'll work with both normal phase and reverse phase, and it's scalable to whatever degree you need. So if you have any questions about that, we have further documents that we can get to you to sort of describe how to use that if you were interested in it. So as far as the summary, we discussed pumping issues and how to diagnose them, showed how to optimize some of your UV parameters with the system, discussed injection procedures, showed the importance of choosing best loading solvents and how the different solvents can actually affect your capacity in chromatography, established guidelines for what you want to do with sample loading and to help eliminate sample loss and possible precipitation and damage. Ways to increase the loading efficiency and column stability, and described a technique to aid in producing more robust methods, which is our method scouting development option. Actually, it's not an option, it's part of the software. So right now I'm going to turn it back to Sharon and let her go ahead and take care of any of the questions that we have been getting throughout the presentation. And hopefully you've enjoyed today's webinar. If you have any questions, here's my information. I'll go ahead and leave it up for you in case you want to get in touch with me. Hopefully you learned something today, and thank you again for joining us. Back to Sharon.
Well, thank you, Todd, for sharing your expertise. And we are now opening up for questions. It looks like a couple of questions have been entered through the Q&A section, so we'll let Todd answer those. And if any of you do have a question, another questions, feel free to submit. Thank you.
Thanks, Sharon. Hopefully, yep, I made sure I wasn't muted anymore. So we do have a couple of questions already. So the first one that we received was, if using ELSD detection, what temperature settings do you recommend for reverse phase, drift tube, and etc.? We typically use one temperature. The defaults that we use in the software are pretty standard in our particular instrumentation. Every ELSD is going to have a little bit of a different temperature optimum value, but typically about 60 degrees is what I've used in the past, thereabouts. If you go too hot, you could potentially have the water coming off as steam, and it will interfere with some of your response factor for your actual compounds. But if you go too low, then of course you're not forming enough droplets. So usually about 60 degrees is where we try to keep it. The second question, what is a good rule of thumb for equilibrating a column to get ready for the next injection? Column volumes, time spaced, etc. What we typically suggest is 2 column volumes at minimum for the column to get re-equilibrated in reverse phase. Now, this didn't say reverse phase or chiral or normal phase. But if you're going to be running isocratic runs, that 2-column value may not be enough. So with chiral columns and other types of isocratic elution, I prefer to get at least 4 or 5 column volumes. And then I try to keep the pumps in the system running as much as I can to reduce the equilibration change. So with that, I will also watch the UV, make sure the baseline is stable, the pressure is stable. But that's usually a pretty good rule of thumb is two column volumes, which would be, well, I guess it depends on your flow rates, but typically for our systems, we usually do 2 to 3 minutes for an equilibration for reverse phase, maybe 10 minutes or more for chiral separations. Are there any other questions out there? So I've answered the 2 that just came in. If you have any other questions, feel free to go ahead and click on the Q&A button and type in your question, and I'll go ahead and answer it. If we don't have any others, I guess I will let you have my information here on the screen. So if you do think of something or have any follow-up questions later on, please don't hesitate to send me an email, or even, like Sharon said, contact her, and she'll get the request to me. So thank you all so much for joining us today. Hopefully we'll see you the next time. Take care.